listening to Owning the Buy Box, an IPSecure podcast. This is the podcast for agencies and brands who want to master Amazon, push out unauthorized competition, and take their business to the next level. You're about to hear a conversation that'll help you maximize your growth on Amazon by owning the Buy Box. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the next part of this podcast with Paolo Ascoli, Director of Ecommerce at Corsearch. I'm your host, Dave Cooper, the CEO and founder of IPSecure. Let's begin. Corsearch is a fairly big company. You guys have been around a really long time, have a fairly long history in the space. When you created the group that you have now, what was sort of the impetus for that? You have this business that's historically been selling, legal services, IP protection or IP management services, trademark related services, and in a big way, a lot of brand protection types of services, but consumed really by, corporate legal departments primarily. So clearly Corsearch sees something happening with this traditional IP protection space and this e-commerce world because they brought you on board. And your role is an e-commerce focused role. So can you tell us more about that? Like, what's Corsearch's perspective? Obviously, they think e-com is a pretty important part of brand protection.
For clarity of the listeners, we need to define what Corsearch means with e-commerce, because e-commerce is a very generic term, and in the most commonly used as defining that the world of setting up, maintaining, and utilizing an online store, an electronic commerce environment, so selling products. We in Corsearch don't sell products. That's the trick here. But where did this come from? Was first of all my grandfather used to say, you don't specialize in what you want in life. You don't specialize in what you want. You specialize in what your clients want. And so that came to be a need from what our clients were looking for, which was not exclusively intellectual property violations online, but with violations related to that other part of the market called gray trade. We define gray trade as everything that is not counterfeit, of course, because that wouldn't be considered gray trade. It's black trade, if you want to call it like in any way, and to that comes from authorized trade. So it's that, middle in between. And so what was needed was a better understanding of the post-sale life cycle of their own products in the online scene, and eventually what solutions could be adopted to try and limit that gray trade effect in a way to try and regain control of the online distribution of their products. And it started in 2019, indeed at the beginning of COVID, where fundamentally authorized sellers and unauthorized sellers alike started evolving. The growth that we discussed before, users becoming sellers and merchants, started obviously increasing online, and where you would see an increase in sales on one side, but an increase of unregulated sales almost. And so with that in place, the idea of trying to implement certain solutions that would reduce that effect started becoming more and more needed and more called for by the brands. Today, matter of fact, the November 2023 INTA benchmarking report shows out of analysis that they did of a pool of 150 different clients from, above 1 billion revenue, above 10 billion revenue, between 1 and 10 billion revenue, and between 100,000 and 1 billion revenue. They did a pool, and apparently the third concern or the third topic of online intellectual property brand protection, let's say, teams is now gray trade and parallel trade, followed by illicit trade and authorized distribution monitoring. These have been appointed as And this is the anti-counterfeiting benchmark report. So as part of the anti-counterfeiting benchmark report, gray trade issues have been highlighted as just right next to, the usual copycat, counterfeit, and IP violation cases. So with that in place, I was privileged enough to study intellectual property, to have a master's dedicated to intellectual property, which also had courses in unfair competition law and antitrust law. So for me, it was almost immediate, the connection between, antitrust, unfair competition, as in, the balancing act of, how do you limit gray trade without obviously offending, violating those very important laws that form part of the unfair competition and antitrust world, but that have a direct connection and leverage with the intellectual property scene. And so it came to me that we could apply certain solutions, which I proposed to our back then clients. Some of them are still with us. Some of them are not, because we solved their problem. So luckily, that was a positive, let's say, exit. But and they started, and they worked. And so we slowly increased the client portfolio, and which warranted obviously for a bigger team and bigger resource allocation. And so here we are today with a series of indeed solutions that tend to tackle the gray trade scene. The name e-commerce just sounded catchy, but who knows if in the future it's not going to change. But with that, we really want to focus on the post-sale life cycle of our client branded products.
I think the desire for corporate legal to look at the gray market in addition to the counterfeiting problem is new. New in terms of like last 5 years, new. Because I've been in the space for 25 years. And 20 years ago, I can tell you, there was not a trademark attorney on the planet that wanted to talk about gray market. Because if the product's authentic, you need an entirely different set of steps and processes, right, to tackle that issue or to quantify that issue or to even begin to mitigate it. And until like the last 5 years, nobody really wanted to do any of those things, quite frankly. And the commercial side of these brands was sort of, burying their head in the sand and saying, a sale's a sale, right? As long as our distributors keep sending us money and we keep growing as a business, we don't really care how that impacts the end user market or the consumer experience on a place like Amazon. And all that thought process, that's dead. That's out the window. And when I meet with brands and I talk to brands who even remotely bring that perspective to the table, I tell them that unequivocally, that you will not succeed, today in the current environment with that perspective. And I think it always shocked me, this aversion. And you brought up antitrust, and I get it. Big brands, especially ones that dominate a certain market or space, they do need to be sensitive to doing things that could be looked at through an antitrust lens. So I get that. Yeah, but you also have every right to know who is selling your product on the world's most popular platform, to the tune of millions per month. I just, if a store opened up in the middle of Amsterdam, right, and it was this massive warehouse selling, again, authentic product, but you don't know where it came from, I think you would investigate if you were the brand owner. So to not do that on a place like Amazon just makes no sense. And I think actually invites risk, considerable risk into the relationship that your brand has with your customer. So that change is really interesting to me because I never understood why it wasn't part of the conversation, and now it clearly is. And I always knew, and I want to see what you think, but counterfeiting, of course, gets most of the attention, right? Because there's a consumer risk element. And we get that. It's not only an infringement, but there's an actual risk to a consumer, and that needs to trump and be more important than everything else. But I think the gray market is where they're really losing massive amounts of money. We had a brand recently that came to us and they don't have a counterfeit problem. What they have is a problem on Amazon with parallel imports, right? They're selling the same product in multiple jurisdictions. Of course, in the foreign jurisdiction, the product is much cheaper. And so these guys are quite smart, right? They are buying it in the foreign jurisdiction and they're shipping it in the United States to create an arbitrage opportunity for themselves. And in the process, they're creating so much price erosion that this big brand, they have a relationship with Amazon, a vendor central relationship. And Amazon went to this brand and said, we're not going to sell your products anymore. This is a household name. And the brand says, what are you talking about? What do you mean? You've been selling our products for 20 years on the platform. Everyone in the world buys our products. They said, well, we can't make any money because of all these unauthorized sellers and people from other jurisdictions. They're driving the price point down on the Amazon platform to the point where Amazon themselves can't make money. So this is a huge problem for the brand because obviously their vendor central relationship generates, millions and millions of dollars a year. And if that disappears, they have a huge problem and they need to fix it. And it all stems from their inability to control the distribution channel on Amazon, which then has consequences like price erosion. So just another good example of why the gray market, I think, is finally getting the attention it should get because it's beginning to really impact all the other parts of the business.
I can tell you why, in my opinion, in the past 5 years, it has started becoming way more of an. In fact, there's a few variables that I can speak of just based on the work that I do, obviously, and not from an academic perspective. I'm sure you could probably criticize and comment. First thing is the increased importance of owning a brand. And when I say owning a brand and depicting yourself as a brand, I don't mean the logo. I don't mean the brand, the logo. I mean the feeling that your consumers get when they buy your products, the sense of belonging, the mission that you transfer with that brand. That has been who wins today is who understands the importance of that essence of creating a new brand. Why do you love buying a Gymshark tee or pair of leggings rather than a Puma one, right? Gymshark has that to it, right? You really love that the sense of belonging that the brand gives you. If you're a gym, a gym aficionado, right? So that is, in my opinion, the first step. So the understanding that using a brand for a purpose only for the reasons of sale is not everything. It's the perception that you give to your consumer, is the experience that you give them. So all of a sudden, if everyone and anyone can sell your brand, that experience gets diluted. It's a fact. It gets diluted. If it doesn't get diluted, and in my opinion it does, it definitely increases the risk of your brand being tarnished, damaged, or your reputation being hindered, because the consumer that receives a product from an unauthorized seller that might not use the same awareness and care in shipping and storing and maintaining that product will think that your product is rubbish when he receives it and is completely damaged, right? And with the increase of 3P sales online, where the numbers have skyrocketed, that has started to happen a lot more. So consumer complaints, I think it's like the 6th or 7th reason that brands are now engaging in companies are engaging in brand protection programs, because they legitimately receive consumer complaints that they cannot handle because warranty is expired or they have no idea where they got that product. So that's the first big reason, in my opinion. Like the presence of that, the increase in that brand reputation and that brand, belonging that has been felt even more in the past years than ever before. The second one is is very practical. You mentioned the sales differences of price deviation, and the example of Amazon is obviously a clear one. Price diversion is obviously a strategy. To permeate different markets, you need to sell your products at different prices, because different markets mean different people have different buying powers. That's reasonable. But then, a little bit like you would build your tax strategy when you have multiple companies in different parts of the world, and then you have to pass, you need to transfer revenue to, the holding in the Netherlands for intellectual property, because the same type of analysis and study needs to be done for your distribution. Meaning, you sell a cheaper product in a country. Well, if it's the same exact product that you're selling in the most expensive one, well, that's pretty basic. That doesn't have a lot of thought to it. You should diversify your inventory in order to include products that you can sell at a high price and products that you can sell at lower price. But those products need to be different. Otherwise, the only solution that you have is just to increase the prices in the markets that are in the less, I would say, less wealthy markets, because you need to fundamentally close the gap that 3P
You can't just have a price difference. That's appropriate for the market. You got to have a value difference.
You need to have a value difference, and a price difference can exist, but it cannot be a 50% price gap, because that means that there's a 50% buffer for a 3P seller to benefit from that. So it needs to be calculated, it needs to be regulated, it needs to be an understanding of shipment costs, an understanding of purchase and moving goods costs. So how much would the seller have to spend to actually get a benefit from selling your brand? And trust me, if the 3P seller, an authorized seller, does not see a margin, he'll stop selling your products. Unless you're Apple, which if you are selling Apple in front of your store, the brand value that we were talking before, the brand impact and sense of ownership, then even if you have a 1% margin, you will do it, because the benefit of having that logo on your storefront is 10 times higher. Even margins don't matter anymore. But if you get to become an Apple, then you won in many other ways, right? So it's,
yeah. I mean, we go to meetings with brands, and they'll people will always look at an Apple or a Nike and use them as some sort of anecdotal examples. And I say, well, you're not Apple and you're not Nike, and the rules for them don't apply to you. Trust me. Thanks for listening to part 3 of this series, featuring Paolo Ascoli of Corsearch on owning the buy box. Be sure to listen to part 4 of this podcast, available on your favorite podcast player.
Been listening to Owning the Buy Box, a show from IPSecure. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. Please give us a rating, leave a comment, and share episodes that you love. That helps us keep delivering you the tools you need to sharpen your competitive edge and ensure your authorized sellers always own the buy box. We'll see you next time.